So might Games Workshop have finally done enough to bring back the venerable Land Raider as an actual choice worth taking? With the potential for melee troops to be charging 20 inches out of this thing, perhaps it's finally got back to the premium threat delivery tool that it really should be. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and today I thought we'd take a focused review of the 10th edition rules for the Land Raider, helpfully previewed by Games Workshop in a recent article. While we still don't know the full context for things yet, and the points costs aren't revealed, I feel like there's quite a lot of reason to be positive about it. As I'm sure most of you guys watching will be aware, Land Raiders are fairly iconic for the Space Marines in Warhammer 40k, an enormous great big crawling tank, protected by thick adamantium to safely transport the elite of the chapter into battle, and also packing some serious firepower in twin las cannon sponsons and heavy bolters. The current standard Land Raider kit from Games Workshop is £55, €70 or $90. Perhaps if anything a tiny bit less than I might have expected for a kit of this size from Games Workshop. It is quite an older one though, and I feel like maybe that's held it back a little. From GW at the moment there's actually 3 different Land Raiders that you can buy. The standard one just gives you the choice of the las cannon sponsons. It's at least a somewhat old miniature at the moment, but I think it holds up pretty well. I do quite like the way that the front assault ramp opens and closes at the same time. It is quite satisfying to play with. Otherwise the options are for the Crusader/Redeemer kit. That one's a little bit more of a recent creation, though it does cost a fair bit more. I think £65 or $112 if I'm not mistaken. And then more recently the plastic version of the Land Raider Proteus has entered the fray. The Heresy era one that you can see in yellow in this picture, vertically mounted las cannons, and it does have the choice of a front assault ramp. That one's got a bit of a retro feel to it, unusually tall and kind of ungainly looking even for a 40k tank, though a lot of people really like them. Annoyingly though, for picking up Land Raiders, at least the standard variant is web store only. It does normally mean that you can't get third-party discounts from them, the 10 or 15% off that they often give for other kits. It looks like Element Games does stock them in the UK if you did want to buy through them to help support the channel, but annoyingly it means that there's no discount off Games Workshop's prices, besides for the Land Raider Proteus, which I guess gets the nod as a more recent kit and is more in circulation. The story of the Land Raider in 9th edition hasn't been a particularly happy one. Rules wise they just really haven't worked well for their intended job, and they've just got all sorts of flaws that has meant that even when Games Workshop reduced the points cost for them repeatedly, still almost no one was really taking them in any sort of numbers. Not being able to transport Primaris for the standard version of them certainly doesn't help. That locks them out of a whole bunch of units right away, and their rules just fell down on the main thing that they wanted to do, trundle up to the enemy and disgorge a bunch of troops right to their faces while keeping up some firepower. First up, they just didn't really add speed to their transported units. In 9th edition they'd just be moving 10 inches. You didn't really want to advance them, as otherwise you'd just be missing out on lots of powerful guns that you've paid for. And say if you compared it to a Space Marine or Terminator squad on foot, you can basically get the same sort of movement distance just by advancing, without the privilege of having to pay for a very expensive tank. The only real movement benefit it tended to give was the actual 3-inch disembarkation range, which was helpful enough, but still probably not enough to be worth the price of entry. Still though, if they could just be useful enough between the guns and the ability to have a unit hide inside, then that could be enough to justify them, but unfortunately the numbers just haven't really generally added up for them. Usually it's just worked out that the more focused options have been better, say having just a Rhino to transport some assault units forward, like say Khorne Berserkers in World Eaters, and then to actually have dedicated ranged damage dealers fulfilling that role, say things like Eradicators if you wanted anti-tank in 9th. The problem for the Land Raider is that it had an awkward bit of anti-synergy. If you moved it forward to use its transport rules, then you might just have all of its guns locked up by enemy chaff. If it gets charged by a cultist squad or something, then it's either got to fall back and fire no guns, or fire its las cannons into the cultists, neither of which is great. On top of that, it didn't really even add durability that much to certain units. Say if you were comparing it against its points cost in Thunderhammer and Stormshield Terminators, usually the Terminators would be tougher against a whole range of guns, and it meant that between all this, even with Games Workshop decreasing the points cost repeatedly, or even giving Chaos Space Marines and World Eaters a toughness 9 Land Raider with damage d6 plus 2 las cannons, it just still meant that they weren't taken competitively by the vast majority of army lists. All of that might be about to change though with its 10th edition datasheets that Games Workshop showed us. Again, no points cost for this yet, so again if it's still overcosted, it'll still be sad times. I feel like this time though, at least with its special rule, it does have a niche. Starting out with the transport rules, first up they've got slightly improved now. The previous version of the Land Raider could transport 10 models, meaning that it could be a bit awkward for certain squads, like characters attached to Terminator squads maybe. But now its transport capacity has been increased to 12. It means that you could take a full 10-man squad in regular power armor, plus 2 attached characters like a captain or lieutenant, 6 Terminator or Gravis, or 4 Centurions if that's what you fancied. We've yet to see the transport capacities for the Redeemer and the Crusader, but if they stay the same then that will be 12 and 16 respectively. It is going to be quite interesting now that this thing has been de-restricted, so it can actually take Primaris units now. You'd be able to put Gravis units like Aggressors in it if you wanted, or maybe units like Blade Guard Veterans. Having access to a lot more choices for transport contents is definitely going to be a big win for this in terms of likelihood of being fielded. In 10th edition, Games Workshop has told us that units are going to be able to get out of transports after the transport has moved, which is quite nice. It means that basically transports the game over are kind of going to have the 9th edition Impulsor rules, being able to slingshot units up onto objectives even if they're quite a long way away. For most units that are going to be deployed like this, they're going to be able to shoot afterwards but not charge. It maybe makes them a lot more tempting for ranged firepower units, particularly close ranged ones, but it looks like the Land Raider with its assault ramp is going to be an exception to that rule. The big assault ramp rule is that after this thing has made a normal move and your squad's got out, it can still make a charge, so this thing really excels in delivering melee units into combat safely now. For a likely scenario, it looks like the Land Raider could move 10 inches via a normal move. If the disembark radius stays the same, then that will be getting units out to within 3-inch range of the Land Raider. Those units almost certainly wouldn't be able to move after that, but then they would be able to charge at 2d6 inches, which means that they'd average 7. Putting that all together, that's an average threat range of 20 inches for units charging out of the Land Raider. Unless anything gets in the way like some pesky terrain, it means that the Land Raider's threat bubble could cover a very big chunk of the board. Your maximum threat range if you roll boxcars for the charge will be 27 inches, and depending on the exact wording of the transport rules, you might also be able to gain the distance of the model's base as well, depending on whether the unit has to disembark within 3 inches of the Land Raider wholly, or just within 3 inches full stop. It basically makes the Land Raider into an armoured slingshot, very tough, and it's going to be hard to kill when it's in your own deployment zone, and then acting like a premium delivery tool to get the charge on the foe rather than the other way around. Most enemy units that move a normal sort of distance are probably not going to be able to close 20 inches in a single turn, so hopefully the unit charging out of the Land Raider should be able to get the charge off. If you roll well, you could potentially even be looking at first turn charges out of this thing. Most 40k deployment zones are 24 inches away from each other, so you could even be charging from one DZ to another. Besides that though, the Land Raider's profile has had a few other tweaks. It still moves 10 inches, which I guess is fine enough. A little bit slower as vehicles go, but not terrible. It's got the smoke keyword on its keyword section. My guess is that one's going to be one of the core stratagems and probably a -1 to hit. Could be okay if it desperately needs to cling to life, but I feel like in 10th edition there's generally going to be better things to spend CP on. The Land Raider's fairly hefty on objectives at objective control 5. It could certainly contest objectives against small squads of troops, particularly if they don't have battle line and the extra objective control that brings. Could certainly be a potential role for it after it has done its transporting business. And if it does blow up, it's got the chance of deadly demise. If you roll a 6 on the explosion, then you shower some mortal wounds at 6-inch range, d6 mortal wounds to every single unit within that radius. It's not going to happen very often, but that is going to be pretty game changing if it ever does happen. Maybe just a slight reason not to have the Land Raider perhaps in the exact centre of your forces if you're playing against an opponent that's got guns that can realistically quite easily kill it turn 1. In terms of toughness, the Land Raider hasn't changed hugely going into 10th. It's still got the same 2+ save and the 16 wounds. I guess this 2-up save might be a little bit more valuable now a bunch of AP seems to have dropped across the board, but it's not vastly different. It has gained a bit of toughness compared with where it was before. Previously it was toughness 8, now it's toughness 12. With the stretching of the toughness system, I still feel like it probably occupies about the same sort of space on the spectrum. But even so, in 10th edition it still looks like it's probably going to be a little bit of a tougher prospect to take down. The las cannons that we've seen so far will be wounding it on a 4+ at strength 12 rather than a 3, and melter weapons on a 5+ rather than a 4+. Just for some rough expected numbers, you'd expect something like 10.5 hits with the vehicle las cannons to bring it down, or 10.5 melter hits within the +2 range. Mid-strength things are going to be a lot weaker into it though. It'd take 36 overcharged plasma hits to bring down a Land Raider, as they'd be wounding it on 5s. For the most part, small arms are just really going to bounce off this thing, wounding on 6s. I feel like in 10th edition though, we are getting an awful lot of rules that are just excessively good against high toughness targets. Things like lethal hits to auto wound, devastating wounds for mortals, or a lot of unrestricted for wound rerolls like Oaths of Moment. Might mean against a lot of factions medium strength weaponry it's not actually quite as tough as you might hope. Finally, while we're on toughness, it looks like it degrades at the normal way for 40k vehicles now, a -1 to hit when it's less than a third wounds remaining, a 1 to 5 for the Land Raider. In terms of damage, it does get to make a little bit of an attack in melee. Vehicles in melee look like they've gained just a little bit of power in 10th edition. These now hit on a 4+ rather than a 6. 6 attacks, all at strength 8, AP 0 and damage 1 with those armoured tracks. Still not exactly going to be a reason that you're going to want to have it in combat most of the time, but it should at least punish enemies for tying it up in combat by smashing 1 or 2 of them. You'd expect to kill something like 1 or 2 squash termagants from this. Finally, for ranged firepower, the primary armament are those Godhammer las cannons on the sponsons, 48 inches with 2 shots each, ballistic skill 3+, and strength 12, AP 3, damage d6 +1. Again, kind of interesting that they don't seem to be using the Twin Links keyword for high strength weaponry. Probably makes sense to be honest though. If you're already strength 12, you're not going to gain quite as much from re-rolling the wound roll. Between 4 shots from both sides, it averages around about 6 or 7 wounds to a Rhino, about 5 to a repulsor, or 4 to an enemy Land Raider. I guess 25% efficient into itself, bar the heavy bolters and upgrades. Talking of which, the twin-linked heavy bolter does get the full wound rerolls. It gets sustained hits for exploding 6s, and gets the standard heavy bolter profile, but rerolling the wounds. Reasonably nice and generalist, it's going to do a bit of chip damage, but not really too much more than that. Then it's got a storm bolter with the profile we've already seen, the multi-melter which is now 2 shots at 18-inch range. It is going to be a bit harder to get that into melter range now, and the option to take on to kill a missile with a single shot hitting on 2s at a big strength 14 AP -3 now. I guess we're going to have to weigh up exactly how many points those upgrades cost. I think they're entirely points dependent as to whether or not they're worth bolting on the top or not. If they're cheap they could certainly be worth it, if not it might just be worth trying to focus a bit more on the transport capacity and not going for random extra damage. Otherwise, between all Games Workshop's previews, we have seen a fair amount of other Space Marine rules by now. Obviously, the Land Raider will be greatly helped out by Oaths of Moment. 4 rerolls to hit and wound are always going to be good, and there's been nothing to suggest so far that vehicles are going to be able to be excluded from that. If you're using the standard Gladius Strike Force for them, it looks like a couple of the combat doctrines could be pretty helpful as well. I feel like the tactical doctrine actually goes some way to shoring up one of the major weaknesses of the Land Raiders that we talked about before. If you trigger the tactical doctrine, a tied up Land Raider could fall back and still fire all of its guns normally. Pretty good if you've got a Land Raider that wants to be aggressive and is throwing those assault units down the range. I feel like a Land Raider is such a big and meaningful unit as well that it could actually be worth using tactical doctrine to help save it and rescue its firepower. It looks like it could be enough worth for a whole army-wide rule to trigger, particularly if it helps out something else elsewhere too. Otherwise, I guess the Devastator Advance and Shoot one could be handy enough turn 1 maybe. Kinda depends whether or not the unit inside needs to get out or not. If you need to disembark then it's not going to be able to advance, so it wouldn't be able to make use of that rule. Otherwise though, faster positioning and maybe getting lines of sight a bit quicker seem good. Otherwise, for support from that Gladius force, there's a stratagem for a +1 to your armor save from it. Not at all bad on a 2+ save unit, and again a Land Raider could potentially be a big enough target that that's worth going for. Depends on whether or not soaking extra enemy fire on it will be meaningful. Depending on the final wording of that Overwatch stratagem, it could be an interesting enough choice for that. 4 las cannons and some twin heavy bolters. Looks like it could be pretty interesting for trying to lay down the final wounds on an enemy unit that moves nearby. The new rules for Overwatch seem to be that you can intercept a unit that moves within 24 inches of it and get a whole load of shots at them hitting on 6s, where if even one of those las cannons lands, it could be enough to finish off a crippled enemy vehicle. Could be worth doing for a command point for the chance of destroying something if said vehicle is just about to do something nasty like shoot or charge you. I'd guess that the smoke stratagem is probably going to be 1 CP as well, again maybe a -1 to hit. If so, then it could be better or worse than Armour of Contempt depending on what's firing at it. I'm sure we'll have other stuff from Codex Space Marines as well. We'll need to see what Tech Marines can offer it, as they're going to be lone operatives that stand beside vehicles, giving them some sort of buffs. Maybe just the +1 to hit and the extra repairs as before. A Land Raider is potentially interesting for any single unit things though. Finally, for transport options, I feel like it's definitely got to be melee, seeing as the assault ramp rule is one of the major selling points to buying this. For an Alpha Strike unit, I feel like you want something that's going to absolutely beat down the enemy's front ranks, but also not be trivially easy to remove in return. Probably something big, tough and tanky. I feel like Blade Guard Veterans or Terminators probably could fit the bill. If going for just a bit more raw damage, then things like Aggressors, Centurions, or maybe Wolfen could all be good possibilities. Overall though, from what we know so far, the Land Raider's certainly looking pretty interesting. Hopefully Games Workshop do manage to make it good, seeing as it's an iconic unit that's been on the shelf for far too long in my opinion. The rules seem interesting enough to make it worthwhile, it just depends on the points I suppose, and I guess it might well be more or less useful to certain armies. It is a very common datasheet shared by things like Custodians and Grey Knights as well, plus Chaos Space Marines, World Eaters, Death Guard and Thousand Suns. From the rules that we have at the moment, it's probably not going to be too hard to envisage how it's going to play though. Deploy it fairly far up the board with a big nasty assault unit in it that you want to get into the opponent's face. It'll need to start somewhere with decent movement lanes, as it's got really quite a wide profile, so you need to know that it can get through. Unlike a lot of things in 40k, I think it's usually going to be pretty hard to hide the massive silhouette of a Land Raider, so you might not have too much luck hiding it behind obscuring type terrain. Though depending on the enemy army, provided they can't actually kill it too easily turn 1, I feel like there's worse things that you could have as a fire magnet. Certainly it's not going to care too much about getting hit by small arms. Then I guess each turn from there you decide whether or not the unit inside can make a big charge. If not, lumber it forward and fire off some guns. And when your unit can get the charge, get them out, make the charge to the enemy. And then you're probably best off having the Land Raider tow onto a midfield objective or something. Get up 5 objective control points on it, and keep on blazing away with the las cannons, which might now have better lines of sight. As mentioned, if it does get tagged in combat with something that it would really rather not be in combat with, the Tactical Doctrine could be an interesting way of rescuing it, allowing it to fall back and shoot happily. In any case, hope you've enjoyed just a few thoughts about the new datasheet for the Space Marine Land Raider. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Could you see this thing actually being useful for once in 10th edition 40k? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about with 10th edition. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's what allows me to work on Warhammer videos as my main thing. If you'd like to help support, channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.